Welcome to the Dread Zone, where we delve into shadows of history that others dare not explore. Before we begin tonight's tale, subscribing to our channel is an invitation I extend to you, and we'd love for you to let us know in the comments where you're watching from. These forgotten stories we continue to bring to light are only possible thanks to your support. The flickering lanterns of the past often illuminate truths we'd rather leave in darkness. Yet, some stories demand to be told, no matter how much we might wish to avert our gaze. One such tale is the account we have for tonight. A narrative passed down through generations in hushed whispers, preserved in forgotten journals and faded letters, always just beneath the surface of recorded history. Tonight, we travel back to the year 1844, to the mist-shrouded hills of western North Carolina, when the name Silverpine was whispered with both reverence and dread. In those days, the dense forests of the Blue Ridge Mountains concealed many secrets, and in the isolated communities dotting the wilderness, superstition held as much power as law. A state in transition was North Carolina in 1844. The Second Great Religious Awakening had swept through the region, leaving behind a populace both devoutly Christian and deeply superstitious. Largely isolated from the political and social changes reshaping the nation remained the mountain communities. Here, ancient beliefs persisted alongside biblical teachings, creating a unique cultural landscape where the supernatural was never fully dismissed, merely reinterpreted through a Christian lens. Around agriculture and timber the economy revolved, with wealthy landowners controlling vast tracts of forest and field. Small settlements had sprung up around mills and trading posts, connected by rutted dirt roads that became nearly impassable during the frequent mountain rains. Slowly traveled news, carried by circuit preachers, peddlers, and the occasional stagecoach bearing mail and newspapers already weeks out of date. It was in this setting, remote, superstitious, governed more by tradition than written law, that the Silverpine family first established their presence and began their mysterious work. The Silverpine family first arrived in Blackwood County in the spring of 1798, when Elias Silverpine, a wealthy merchant from Boston, purchased 500 acres of prime forest land in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The locals spoke of how Elias appeared one morning at the county clerk's office, his clothes immaculate despite having apparently traveled for weeks, his pale blue eyes never blinking as he counted out gold coins to pay for the land in full. A time when North Carolina was still finding its footing as part of the young United States, this was. The Revolutionary War had ended just 15 years prior, and the scars of that conflict still marked both the land and its people. Hardscrabble farmers or trappers were most settlers in the region, their lives defined by constant struggle against the elements and the unforgiving mountain terrain. Immediate curiosity and suspicion were sparked by the sudden appearance of a wealthy, refined family from the north. The clerk who processed the land purchase, one Thomas Beaumont, would later recount to his grandchildren how the stack of gold coins seemed to glow with an inner light as Elias pushed them across the rough wooden counter. There was something unnatural about the way those coins caught the sunlight, Beaumont reportedly said. And something stranger still about the way Mr. Silverpine's shadow seemed to shrink away from him rather than following him as he moved about the office. In the shipping trade, Elias claimed to have made his fortune, importing exotic goods from Europe and the Far East. Yet no records existed of his business ventures in Boston or any other American port. When questioned about specific voyages or cargo, he would smile thinly and change the subject, offering instead to invest in local enterprises, offers that few could afford to refuse, despite their misgivings about the source of his wealth. Within 6 months, completed at the top of the highest hill in the county stood Silverpine Manor, a testament to wealth that seemed to have materialized from thin air. The 3-story home with its white columns and sprawling verandas was visible for miles around, its windows gleaming like watchful eyes over the valley below. Local craftsmen and laborers hired to assist with construction spoke of impossible deadlines met, of work continuing through the night guided by lanterns that burned with an unusual blue flame, of foundations dug deeper than any home required, as if the structure were being anchored to the very bones of the mountain. Peculiar was the architecture itself, a blend of neoclassical elegance typical of wealthy southern homes and older, more esoteric elements that seemed out of place in the American wilderness. Gargoyles perched at the corners of the roof, their faces neither fully human nor entirely bestial. The main entrance featured an archway inscribed with symbols that resembled no alphabet known to the local stonemasons. Most unusual was the complete absence of mirrors or reflective surfaces throughout the mansion. Even the windows were made of a special glass that conveyed light but offered no reflection. Equally remarkable were the surrounding grounds. Gardens of night-blooming flowers imported from Eastern Europe and Central Asia encircled the house, their heady perfume filling the air after sunset. The forests beyond were carefully maintained, with certain trees marked by strange symbols carved into their bark. A series of stone circles, each precisely aligned with astronomical markers, dotted the property at regular intervals. Local Cherokee guides refused to approach these circles, claiming they disrupted the natural energies of the mountain and created thin places where the boundary between worlds grew dangerously permeable. Elias brought with him a young wife, Constance, whose delicate beauty and quiet demeanor sparked curiosity among the townsfolk of nearby Ravens Hollow. Rarely seen in public, she was, and when she did venture into town, she kept her face partially hidden beneath an elaborate bonnet, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground before her. A translucent quality was possessed by her skin that the local women envied and attempted to recreate with various powders and lotions, never quite capturing the otherworldly luminescence that seemed to emanate from within rather than reflect from without. In an era when a woman's worth was often measured by her social graces and ability to entertain, particularly noteworthy was Constance Silverpine's reclusiveness. She never hosted the tea gatherings or dinner parties expected of a lady of her station. The few women who claimed to have conversed with her described a voice like distant wind chimes, melodious but somehow hollow, as if echoing from somewhere beyond the physical realm. As mysterious as those of her husband remained the origins of Constance Silverpine. Elias introduced her as the daughter of a Romanian nobleman educated in the finest European academies. Her accent, when she did speak, contained elements of several Eastern European languages, blended in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint her exact origins. She carried with her a small locked chest of dark wood bound with silver bands, which was never far from her side, and which no servant was ever permitted to touch. One maid, employed briefly at the manor in those early years, claimed to have glimpsed the contents of this chest when Constance opened it late one night. The girl, Abigail Porter, fled the household the following morning, seeking sanctuary with the local minister. When questioned about what she had seen, Abigail would only say that the chest contained soil darker than any in these mountains and things that should not be preserved. She refused to elaborate further and left the region entirely a week later, reportedly heading west with a group of settlers bound for the Ohio Territory. The couple had no children when they arrived, which initially fueled speculation about Constance's health or Elias's virility. Such gossip was common in small communities where family lineage and progeny were considered essential aspects of a successful marriage. The merchant's obvious wealth afforded him some protection from open ridicule, but whispers persisted in the back rooms of taverns and during quilting circles. It wasn't long before rumors began to circulate about the strange habits of the Silverpines. Servants hired from town spoke in hushed tones about the peculiar demands of their employers, mirrors removed from every room, water basins always emptied immediately after use, polished silver locked away except for special occasions. Some claimed they had been dismissed merely for carrying a looking glass in the presence of Mrs. Silverpine. No regular meal schedule was maintained by the family, at least none that conformed to normal patterns. The kitchen might remain cold and unused for days, then suddenly burst into frantic activity in the middle of the night. Food deliveries consisted primarily of rare meats, always requested as fresh and bloody as possible. Yet, guests invited to the rare formal dinners at the manor reported that the Silverpines themselves seemed to consume very little, merely moving food around their plates while encouraging their visitors to eat heartily. Most disturbing were the nocturnal activities observed by those who lived or worked near the estate. Lights could be seen moving through the forest in the darkest hours of night, following no established paths. Strange chanting in languages unknown to local ears sometimes carried on the wind during the new moon. Livestock on neighboring farms would be found dead at dawn, their bodies unmarked save for small, precise wounds at the neck or wrist, their carcasses drained of blood but otherwise untouched. But wealth commanded respect. And Elias Silverpine's generosity toward the community, funding the construction of the town's first proper church and schoolhouse, ensured that any whispers remained just that, whispers. Loudly spoke money in the fledgling republic, where class distinctions were supposedly abandoned, but prosperity still opened doors that remained firmly closed to the poor. Substantial enough to silence even the most suspicious tongues, at least in public forums, were the Silverpine's donations. Instinctively, Elias seemed to understand that philanthropy served as both shield and distraction. When questions arose about his business dealings or the source of his seemingly inexhaustible wealth, the pastor would invariably remind his congregation of the family's Christian charity. The new bell in the church tower, inscribed with the Silverpine name, rang out each Sunday, drowning out the murmurs of those who wondered why the donors themselves were never present for services. By 1802, rumors of strange occurrences on the Silverpine property had begun to spread beyond Raven's Hollow. Travelers passing near the estate reported hearing unearthly music drifting through the trees on moonless nights. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to approach the property boundaries, cowering and whimpering if forced to draw near. Local Cherokee guides who had traversed these mountains for generations now gave the area a wide berth, telling settlers that the land around the manor had become a place where shadows grow teeth. These stories might have remained local folklore had it not been for the winter of 1805, when 3 children from the village vanished within the span of a month. The disappearances coincided with the first pregnancy of Constance Silverpine, a fact noted by many, but spoken of only in the most private conversations. Search parties combed the mountains but found no trace of the missing children. Their vanishing was eventually attributed to wild animals or perhaps a harsh winter storm that had swept through the region. Shortly after the final child disappeared, Constance was seen in town for the first time in months, her pregnancy now obvious despite the heavy winter cloak she wore. Witnesses described how snow seemed to evaporate before it could touch her skin and how her breath produced no vapor in the freezing air. Most disturbing were reports that her shadow, cast by the winter sun, moved independently of her body, always a fraction of a second behind her movements, as if struggling to keep pace. The birth of Edgar Silverpine in the spring of 1806 was not attended by any midwife or physician from Raven's Hollow. Instead, a strange woman arrived at the manor a week before the delivery, a tall, gaunt figure with silver hair despite her apparently youthful face. Local residents reported that she came on foot, carrying only a small black bag, having walked from no clear direction through the forest during a thunderstorm, her clothes and hair perfectly dry when she emerged from the trees. According to servants who later spoke of the event, the labor lasted 3 days. The manor echoed with screams that sounded less like a woman in childbirth and more like a soul in torment. On the final night, as Constance's cries reached their peak, a darkness fell over the valley that went beyond the normal absence of light. Witnesses described it as a thickness in the air that smothered lanterns and muffled sound, a darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. When dawn finally broke, the strange midwife was gone, having departed without being seen, leaving no footprints in the mud surrounding the estate. Elias announced the birth of a healthy son, though no one from the town was permitted to see either mother or child for several weeks. When Constance finally appeared in public again, remarkably unchanged by the experience of childbirth she seemed. Her figure was as slender as before, her skin still possessing that unearthly luminescence, her movements perhaps even more graceful than previously. Largely hidden from public view during his early years was the infant Edgar. Glimpses reported by delivery men or cleaning women hired for special occasions described a strangely alert baby who never cried and whose eyes seemed to follow movements with unnatural focus and intelligence. Several servants refused to return to the manor after encountering the child, though they struggled to articulate precisely what had disturbed them about the experience. Victoria Silverpine was born 3 years later in 1809 under similar circumstances, the same mysterious midwife, the same unnatural darkness, the same rapid recovery by Constance. And again, children had vanished from nearby settlements in the months leading up to the birth, this time, 5 young ones from villages as far as 20 miles from Raven's Hollow. As before, no trace was ever found, despite extensive searches. Thomas, the youngest of the Silverpine children, arrived in 1814, following the established pattern. By this time, however, the connection between the pregnancies and the disappearances had become too obvious to ignore, at least among certain segments of the community. A group of fathers whose children had vanished attempted to approach the manor with torches and hunting rifles, intent on confronting Elias. They never reached the house. Witnesses described a sudden fog descending from the mountain, enveloping the men completely. When it cleared an hour later, the would-be vigilantes were found wandering in the forest, miles from their intended destination, with no memory of what had occurred after they set out and no recollection of why they had armed themselves in the first place. By 1820, the Silverpines had 3 children: Edgar, the eldest at 21, Victoria, 19, and young Thomas, barely 16. All 3 inherited their father's striking height and their mother's ethereal beauty, pale skin that seemed to glow in the moonlight, hair as black as a raven's wing, and eyes of such a light blue they appeared almost colorless in certain light. Each birth had followed the same pattern: Constance's withdrawal from public view, unexplained disappearances in nearby communities, and then the sudden announcement of a new Silverpine heir, with no midwife or doctor ever attending the delivery. Educated at home were the children, tutored by a succession of scholarly men who arrived from distant cities and rarely remained longer than a year. These tutors, when they did interact with the townspeople, spoke of the extraordinary intelligence of their pupils, particularly their facility with languages both modern and ancient. One tutor, a former Oxford don named Reginald Marsh, became infamous in Raven's Hollow for his heavy drinking following his dismissal from Silverpine Manor. In his cups, he would mutter about unnatural aptitudes and knowledge no child should possess, though he would grow tight-lipped and fearful when pressed for details. As the Silverpine children grew older, they began to appear occasionally in town, always immaculately dressed in the latest fashions from Europe, always unfailingly polite, yet somehow distant, as if observing human interactions rather than participating in them. Edgar, the eldest, developed a reputation as an accomplished horseman and marksman, though it was noted that he only rode in the earliest hours of morning or late evening, claiming a sensitivity to midday heat. Victoria displayed remarkable musical talents. Her playing of the pianoforte was said to bring listeners to tears, though some claimed these were tears of inexplicable dread rather than moved emotion. Thomas, the youngest, charmed the local girls with his quick wit and courtly manners, a rare flower of sophistication in the rugged mountain community. The peculiarities of the family might have remained nothing more than fodder for local gossip had it not been for the incident at the Midsummer Festival of 1822. It was there that young Catherine Harlow, daughter of the town physician, encountered Victoria Silverpine in the ladies' retiring room. The most significant social event in Raven's Hollow was the Midsummer Festival, a 3-day celebration marking the summer solstice that blended Christian observances with older pagan traditions that persisted in the isolated mountain communities. Families from throughout the county gathered in the town square for music, dancing, feasting, and various competitions of skill and strength. The Silverpines rarely attended such public gatherings, but the summer of 1822 proved an exception, perhaps because Elias had funded the construction of a new bandstand for the occasion, or perhaps for reasons more directly related to the alignment of the stars on that particular solstice. The entire family appeared at dusk on the festival's second day, their arrival creating an immediate stir among the revelers. They moved through the crowd with fluid grace, accepting greetings with perfect courtesy while maintaining an invisible barrier that discouraged any genuine closeness. Elias and Constance seated themselves on the specially reserved chairs near the bandstand, observing the dancing with the benevolent detachment of royalty among commoners. The three Silverpine children mingled more freely, though always remaining within sight of their parents. Victoria, particularly striking that evening in a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the lantern light, attracted considerable attention from the young men of the town. She danced with several partners, her movements so perfectly matched to the music that other couples paused to watch in admiration. After several reels, she excused herself and retreated to the ladies' retiring room established in the milliner's shop adjacent to the square. Catherine Harlow, 17 years old and considered the most level-headed of her generation, had entered the retiring room moments earlier to repair a loose ribbon on her dress. The two young women had never formally met, despite Catherine's father being one of the few townspeople who occasionally visited the manor in his professional capacity as physician. Catherine would later recount to anyone who would listen how she had been adjusting her hair in the small mirror mounted on the wall when she noticed Victoria standing behind her. Yet when Catherine turned to greet her, she realized with growing horror that while Victoria was clearly present in the room, close enough to touch, her reflection was entirely absent from the mirror. "I saw nothing," Catherine would insist, her voice trembling even years later. "Just the wall behind where she stood, as if she wasn't there at all. I blinked several times, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. I even reached out to touch her sleeve. The silk was cool beneath my fingers, though she had been dancing moments before and should have been warm with exertion, but the mirror showed only my own frightened face and an empty space where she should have been." Only deepened the mystery was Victoria's response to Catherine's startled cry. She had simply smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and whispered, "Now you understand why we keep to ourselves," before gliding from the room. The peculiar choice of words, not a denial or explanation, but an acknowledgement that implied a secret long held, would haunt Catherine for years to come. By morning, the story had spread throughout Ravens Hollow. Some dismissed it as the imaginings of a girl who had sampled too much festival wine. Others recalled their own strange encounters with the Silverpines over the years, how they never seemed to cast proper shadows on bright days, how no portrait of the family hung in their grand home despite their obvious wealth and status. The more superstitious members of the community began to make the sign of the cross when the Silverpine name was mentioned, while others openly scoffed at such medieval thinking. Quickly divided the town between those who believed Catherine's account and those who thought her confused or attention-seeking. The division largely fell along class lines, with the wealthier residents, those who benefited most directly from Elias Silverpine's investments and patronage, leading the skeptics, while laborious and farmers, who had long harbored suspicions about the family on the hill, found the story merely confirmed what they had always suspected. Reverend Thomas Blackwood, who owed his new church to Silverpine generosity, delivered a pointed sermon the following Sunday on the dangers of gossip and the sin of bearing false witness. Without naming Catherine directly, he made it clear that accusations of supernatural phenomena were unwelcome in his congregation and smacked of the very superstition that enlightened Christians should reject. Half the church nodded in solemn agreement, the other half noted that the Reverend's gaze never quite met theirs during his impassioned delivery. Concerned for his daughter's mental well-being and reputation, Dr. Harlow attempted to quell the rumors. "Mirrors play tricks on the eyes," he declared publicly. "My daughter was mistaken, nothing more." A man of science in an age when rational thought was beginning to challenge centuries of superstition, he was. Yet, he could not entirely dismiss his daughter's conviction. Catherine had always been level-headed and observant, not given to flights of fancy or emotional outbursts. Her detailed account, delivered with such unwavering certainty, troubled him deeply. But privately, the good doctor began to investigate. His journals, discovered decades later in the attic of his former home, detail his growing obsession with the Silverpine family and their condition, what he came to call the absence of reflective presence. The leather-bound volumes, their pages yellowed with age and stained with what appeared to be both candle wax and blood, provide a meticulous record of his inquiry. Initially, Dr. Harlow approached his investigation as a medical puzzle. Could there be some rare physiological condition that affected how light reflected off the human form? He consulted his limited medical library and wrote to colleagues in Boston and Philadelphia, describing the phenomenon in theoretical terms to avoid arousing suspicion. The responses he received were uniformly dismissive. The laws of optics simply did not allow for a solid object to fail to produce a reflection. Frustrated by the limitations of medical science, the doctor turned to older, more esoteric sources of knowledge. He began collecting folklore and legends from the diverse communities that inhabited the mountains, European settlers, Cherokee healers, and the descendants of escaped slaves who had formed hidden settlements in the most remote valleys. Each culture had its own stories of beings who walked without reflections, though the names and specific attributes varied widely. Entries from this period reveal that Dr. Harlow had begun to research old medical texts and folklore, searching for any mention of similar phenomena. His notes reference obscure European cases dating back to the 16th century, primarily in isolated mountain villages in Romania and northern Italy, where entire families were said to cast no image upon reflective surfaces. The doctor's investigation soon extended beyond local sources. He established correspondence with scholars in Europe, particularly in the Carpathian regions where similar phenomena had been reported. Books began to arrive at his home, ancient tomes with cracked leather bindings, their pages covered in languages few in Raven's Hollow could read. Catherine, who had received an unusually thorough education for a young woman of her time, assisted her father in translating passages from Latin, French, and German texts. One particular entry, dated October 3, 1822, stands out. I have corresponded with Professor James Whitmore of the Medical College in Philadelphia regarding the Silverpine anomaly. He suggests a rare hereditary condition affecting the physical properties of light reflection. But this explanation seems wholly inadequate. Light follows immutable laws. No medical condition could possibly alter such fundamental principles of natural philosophy. The more I research, the more I am drawn to explanations that lie beyond the realm of accepted science. The Cherokee medicine man, Grey Wolf, whom I consulted regarding a patient's rheumatism last week, spoke of hollow peoples who walk among us, beings who appear human but lack a true soul, and thus cast no reflection. In his tradition, such entities are not necessarily malevolent, but are fundamentally different from humans, bound by different rules and driven by different hungers. The Romani travelers who passed through Raven's Hollow this summer shared similar beliefs, though in their tales, the reflectionless ones are explicitly dangerous. Strigo, they called them. Undead beings who feed on the life essence of the living. Their elder, a woman whose age I could not guess, gave me a charm of rowan wood and silver thread that she claimed would reveal the true nature of such creatures. I accepted it to be polite, though I place no stock in such superstitions. I am beginning to suspect something far more unnatural at work. The townsfolk whisper of witchcraft and damnation, but I am a man of science. There must be a rational explanation, even if it lies beyond our current understanding. Dr. Harlow's next entries document his efforts to observe the Silverpines directly, though discreetly. He positioned himself strategically during town gatherings, noting how the family members always seemed aware of reflective surfaces around them, subtly adjusting their positions to avoid being captured in mirrors or polished metal. He recorded the precise angle of the sun during outdoor encounters and the curious way their shadows sometimes appeared to lag behind their movements, as if reluctantly following their owners. Most revealing were his observations of their eating habits. In public, the Silverpines would accept plates of food at social functions, but through various sleights of hand and careful misdirection, managed to consume very little. Dr. Harlow noted that Elias was particularly skilled at appearing to eat heartily while actually transferring food to napkins or strategically redistributing it around his plate. The children employed similar tactics, though with less finesse, occasionally earning sharp glances from their father when their deception became too obvious. The doctor also documented the family's apparent aversion to certain substances and objects. They would not touch silver directly, always using gloves when handling silverware. They avoided crossing running water whenever possible, choosing circuitous routes around even small streams. Most telling was their reaction to religious symbols, not the dramatic recoiling depicted in lurid tales, but a subtle tensing, a barely perceptible flinch when confronted with a crucifix or when passing the church. These observations, combined with the growing body of folklore he had collected, led Dr. Harlow to a conclusion he was reluctant to articulate even in his private journals. The word vampire appears only once in his notes, written in a shaky hand at the bottom of a page and then heavily crossed out, as if he feared that naming the thing might somehow summon it. Instead, he developed his own terminology, referring to the Silverpines as hemophages or life essence consumers, clinical terms that perhaps made the concept more palatable to his scientific mind. Whatever language he used, the implications were the same. The family on the hill was not human in the conventional sense, but something else entirely, something that had learned to move among humans while remaining fundamentally separate from them. Unusually harsh was the following winter, with snow blanketing the mountains by early November and not retreating until late March. During these cold, dark months, the Silverpines withdrew entirely from public life. No member of the family was seen in town, and supplies were delivered to the manor by a taciturn caretaker who offered no conversation beyond what was strictly necessary for transactions. The isolation of winter gave rise to new rumors. Hunters tracking game reported lights moving through the forest surrounding Silverpine Manor at odd hours, lanterns that seemed to float without carriers through the trees. A trapper named Jeremiah Collins claimed to have found a series of strange footprints in the snow near the northern boundary of the Silverpine property, tracks that began and ended abruptly, as if whatever made them had descended from and returned to the sky. Most disturbing was his description of the unusual pattern, like a man's boot, he told patrons at the tavern, but with the toes pointing backward, as if walking in reverse. Such tales might have been dismissed as the exaggerations of men too long alone in the wilderness had it not been for the discovery of 2 deer carcasses at the edge of town one February morning. The animals had been completely drained of blood with no other visible wounds except for small, precise punctures at their throats. When the town butcher examined the remains, he declared he had never seen anything like it in 30 years of dressing game. It wasn't wolves or mountain lions, he insisted. Those leave a mess. This was clinical. Whatever did this took only the blood and left the meat untouched. Ain't natural and ain't like any hunter I ever met. Similar incidents continued throughout the winter, livestock found bloodless but otherwise unharmed, wild animals discovered in the same condition at the edges of farms. Most disturbing were the reports from outlying homesteads of children waking screaming in the night, claiming that pale faces had been watching them through frosted windows. In every case, footprints were found in the snow beneath those windows the next morning, prints that began and ended suddenly, with no trail leading to or from the house. As winter deepened, anxiety grew in Raven's Hollow. Families began taking precautions unheard of in previous years, hanging garlic and rowan branches over doors and windows, drawing crude crosses on doorposts with coal or paint, keeping silver objects prominently displayed in common rooms. Reverend Blackwood denounced these practices as pagan superstition, but his congregation continued them nonetheless, often in secret if they felt their pastor might disapprove. When spring finally arrived, bringing with it the vibrant renewal of life to the valley, Elias Silverpine emerged from his seclusion to make an announcement that would further fuel the growing unease. His eldest son, Edgar, was to be married to Miss Eleanor Blackwood, the orphaned niece of Judge Blackwood from the neighboring county. Quite a stir was caused by the engagement, not least because few in Raven's Hollow had ever met or even heard of Eleanor Blackwood before the announcement. Judge Blackwood himself seemed surprised by the match when questioned, admitting that his niece had only recently arrived from abroad to live under his care following the tragic death of her parents in a fire. When pressed for details about Eleanor's background or how she had met Edgar Silverpine, the judge became uncharacteristically vague, his usual judicial precision giving way to muttered generalities and abrupt changes of subject. Unseen in Raven's Hollow remained Eleanor herself, supposedly recovering from the journey to her uncle's home and preparing for her new life as Mrs. Silverpine. Rumors abounded about her circumstances. Some said she was exceptionally beautiful but sickly, others claimed she was disfigured by the fire that claimed her parents and thus kept hidden from curious eyes, a few whispered that she was already with child and the hasty marriage was designed to preserve the honor of both families. Ever methodical in his investigation of the Silverpines, Dr. Harlow made a point of visiting Judge Blackwood's estate on the pretext of discussing the establishment of a proper hospital in the county. His real purpose, as his journal reveals, was to catch a glimpse of the mysterious bride-to-be and determine whether she shared the unusual traits of the family she was about to join. His entry from this visit describes a strange encounter. "I was received cordially by Judge Blackwood, though he seemed distracted and unusually pale. When I inquired after the health of his niece, hoping for an introduction, a shadow passed over his features. He informed me that Eleanor was resting and could not be disturbed, but assured me of her excellent health and spirits. As he spoke these words, his hand trembled slightly, and he would not meet my gaze. Most curious was what occurred as I was leaving. Passing by a partially open door on the upper floor, I glimpsed a young woman seated at a window, her back to me. Her hair was the same raven black as the Silverpine children, and she was unnaturally still, not even appearing to breathe as she gazed out at the approaching dusk. I paused, and though I made no sound, she turned her head slightly, not enough for me to see her face, but enough to make me certain she was aware of my presence. The air in the hallway suddenly grew cold, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee the house, though I cannot explain why. As I hurried down the stairs, I distinctly heard a soft laugh from the room above, followed by words in a language I did not recognize, but which raised the hair on my arms. Judge Blackwood was waiting at the front door, his expression now composed but his eyes haunted. He bid me good night with forced joviality and practically pushed me from his home. Set for June 21st, the summer solstice, was the wedding, a date that did not go unnoticed by the more superstitious members of the community, who whispered that such a day held special power for those who dealt in unnatural arts. Odd for practical reasons as well struck the timing, as June in the Carolina mountains brought unpredictable weather, from stifling heat to sudden violent thunderstorms. Most local weddings were traditionally held in the more temperate months of April or October. With remarkable efficiency proceeded preparations for the ceremony. Silverpine Manor underwent a transformation, with workmen brought in from as far away as Charleston to renovate and decorate. New furnishings arrived daily, carried up the winding road to the estate in a procession of wagons. Gardens were expanded, outbuildings constructed, and the entire property surrounded by a new wrought iron fence topped with sharp finials that several observers noted resembled silver spikes. Most significant was the construction of a special pavilion in the eastern garden, a structure of white marble and dark wood that followed no architectural style familiar to the local builders. The pavilion was oriented precisely to the point where the sun would rise on the morning of the solstice, its central arch framing the first rays of dawn. The stone floor was inlaid with symbols similar to those that adorned the manor's entrance, arranged in concentric circles around a central altar of polished obsidian. Highly coveted were invitations to the wedding, despite, or perhaps because of, the growing unease surrounding the Silverpine family. To be excluded was to be confirmed as unimportant, to be included was to be granted entry to a world of wealth and privilege that few in Raven's Hollow would otherwise experience. Even those who crossed themselves at the mention of the Silverpine name found excuses to accept when the embossed cards arrived at their homes. 3 weeks before the ceremony, Dr. Harlow received his invitation, a heavy, cream-colored card delivered by a messenger who appeared at his door precisely at midnight, handed him the envelope without a word, and vanished into the darkness before the doctor could respond. Conventional enough in its wording was the invitation itself, though the doctor noted that the ink seemed to shimmer slightly in certain lights, and the paper retained the faint scent of an unfamiliar perfume that caused his head to swim momentarily when he first opened the envelope. His journal entry that night reveals his conflicted feelings. I should refuse this invitation on principle, given what I now suspect about the Silverpines. Yet I cannot deny that it presents an unparalleled opportunity to observe the family in a setting where their guard might be lowered by the festivities. I am particularly interested in seeing this Eleanor Blackwood, who I strongly suspect is no more the judge's niece than I am the King of England. There is risk in attending, certainly. If they are what I believe them to be, they may well be aware of my investigation. Elias has always struck me as a man who misses little, and there have been moments when I felt his eyes on me, even when he was nowhere in sight. Still, they are unlikely to attempt anything in full view of the county's most prominent citizens. And I shall take certain precautions, the silver mirror in my waistcoat pocket, the Rowan charm provided by the Romani woman, perhaps a small vial of holy water, though I feel somewhat foolish even considering such medieval safeguards. In the days leading up to the wedding, Ravens Hollow buzzed with activity and speculation. New dresses were commissioned, old suits brushed and pressed, horses groomed to glossy perfection for the procession to the manor. Beneath the excitement, however, ran an undercurrent of anxiety. Several families who had received invitations suddenly announced they would be traveling to visit relatives in distant towns, convenient excuses that allowed them to avoid the event without directly refusing the Silverpines' hospitality. Clear and unseasonably warm dawned the morning of the wedding, the sun rising into a cloudless sky that promised a sweltering day ahead. Guests began arriving at Silverpine Manor shortly after noon, their carriages forming a line that stretched nearly to the town below. Each vehicle was met at the gate by silent attendants in black livery, who directed the visitors to a receiving area on the eastern lawn where refreshments were served. Scheduled for 3 p.m. was the ceremony, when the sun would be at its highest point, an unusual time for a wedding, particularly for a family rumored to prefer the shadows. This timing was later interpreted by Dr. Harlow as a deliberate statement, a demonstration of power meant to show that the Silverpines could withstand even direct sunlight when it suited their purposes. At precisely 3 p.m. began the ceremony. Edgar Silverpine stood beneath the pavilion, his tall figure made more imposing by his perfect posture and the severe cut of his black suit. Beside him, his father Elias and younger brother Thomas maintained the same rigid stance, their pale faces impassive as they surveyed the gathered guests. Constance and Victoria sat in the front row, both dressed in silver-grey gowns that seemed to capture and reflect the sunlight in mesmerizing patterns, drawing the eye away from their faces. A somber, unfamiliar melody was played by a string quartet, a melody that several guests later described as beautiful but wrong somehow, with harmonies that seemed to shift in unexpected directions, creating a sense of unease rather than the joy typically associated with wedding music. Not local were the musicians themselves, but had been brought in from Charleston specifically for the occasion. They performed with mechanical precision, never looking up from their instruments, their expressions blank as if in a trance. A hush fell over the assembly as Eleanor appeared at the end of the garden path, a vision in ivory silk. Her face was partially obscured by a delicate veil, but even through this gossamer barrier, her beauty was apparent. With fluid grace she moved toward her future husband, each step measured and deliberate. As she passed the seated guests, several would later report a curious sensation, a momentary chill despite the June heat, a brief vertigo as if the ground beneath them had shifted. One elderly woman claimed to have seen Eleanor's feet hovering an inch above the grass, though this account was generally attributed to the poor lighting beneath the oak trees and the witnesses' failing eyesight. As the minister began the ceremony, Dr. Harlow made his move. Under the pretense of reaching for his handkerchief, he withdrew the small silver mirror from his pocket and angled it carefully to capture the wedding party. What he saw, or rather, what he did not see, caused him to gasp audibly, drawing several irritated glances from nearby guests. The mirror reflected the minister, the floral arrangements, the white pavilion. But where the Silverpine men and the bride should have been, there was nothing but the background of trees and sky. Seated beside her father, Catherine felt him stiffen and followed his gaze to the mirror. Her face drained of color, and she clutched his arm so tightly that he would later discover bruises in the shape of her fingers. This was no trick of perception or lighting, no optical illusion that could be explained away by science. The evidence was literally in hand, irrefutable proof that the Silverpines were not natural beings. Without further incident concluded the ceremony, though Dr. Harlow would later write that he found himself unable to focus on the proceedings, his mind racing with the implications of what he had witnessed. The absence of reflection extended to the bride, confirming his suspicion that the Silverpines had deliberately sought out a match with someone who shared their unnatural trait. The vows exchanged between Edgar and Eleanor contained subtle deviations from the traditional ceremony that few in attendance noted, but Dr. Harlow recorded faithfully. Where the minister should have invoked divine blessing, he instead spoke of eternal bonds and union transcending mortal limitations. The couple pledged not until death do us part, but rather beyond the constraints of death and life, words that sent a visible shudder through several of the older guests. Most peculiar was the exchange of blood rather than rings, a small, swift ritual performed so deftly that only those in the closest rows could see clearly what transpired. Edgar and Eleanor each pricked their own finger with a silver pin, then pressed the wounds together, their blood mingling as the minister bound their hands with a cord of braided white and red silk. Throughout this ceremony, their eyes remained locked on each other with an intensity that many guests later described as hypnotic or predatory. During the reception that followed, Dr. Harlow observed the family closely. He noted that despite the summer heat, they consumed no food or drink in public view. The wedding feast, elaborate and expensive though it was, seemed more for the benefit of the guests than the family celebrating. As twilight descended and lanterns were lit throughout the garden, Dr. Harlow found himself approached by Elias Silverpine himself. The family patriarch's expression was pleasant enough, but his eyes held a warning that made the doctor's blood run cold. "I couldn't help but notice your scientific curiosity earlier, Doctor," Elias said, his voice soft yet carrying an unmistakable edge. "While I appreciate a man of learning, I must caution against pursuing certain lines of inquiry too vigorously. Some mysteries are best left unexplored for the good of all concerned." Before Dr. Harlow could respond, Elias continued, "I understand your daughter was the first to notice Victoria's unique condition. A perceptive young woman. I hope her talents lead her to wisdom rather than misfortune." The threat, though veiled, was unmistakable. Dr. Harlow nodded stiffly and assured Elias that his interest was purely academic. The patriarch smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes, and moved on to greet other guests. That night, upon returning home, Dr. Harlow made a lengthy entry in his journal, detailing everything he had observed and speculating on possible explanations. His writing, usually measured and precise, grew increasingly frantic as the entry progressed. "They are not natural beings. Of this I am now certain. What they are I cannot say with any scientific confidence. The legends of vampires and spirits come to mind, but I have always dismissed such tales as the products of ignorance and superstition. Yet today I have seen with my own eyes something that defies rational explanation. The absence of reflection is but one symptom of their otherness. I have observed over the years that none of the family appears to age at a normal rate. Elias looks no different now than when he arrived in our town nearly 25 years ago, and Constance, who must be well into her 40s, retains the appearance of a woman half her age. More disturbing still is the apparent purpose behind today's union. This was no love match, despite the performance for our benefit. The way Elias watched the ceremony suggested satisfaction in a plan long in the making. I believe he has been breeding his children deliberately, selecting mates with specific traits to strengthen whatever unnatural bloodline they represent. I fear for young Eleanor, whether she came to this union knowing the true nature of the family she was joining, or if she is herself one of their kind. And I fear more for our community, for what purpose these beings might have in establishing themselves among us. In the days following the wedding, life in Raven's Hollow returned to its normal rhythms. The Silverpines once again retreated into the privacy of their estate, seen only occasionally when business necessitated their presence in town. Edgar and his bride were said to be honeymooning in Europe, though no one had witnessed their departure and no carriage had been seen leaving the manor. For months passed without incident, and the gossip surrounding the wedding had just begun to fade when the town was shaken by a new development. Judge Blackwood, visiting his niece at Silverpine Manor, was found dead on the road back to his own estate, his horse still dutifully standing beside his body when a local farmer discovered him at dawn. The official cause of death was determined to be a sudden apoplexy, a stroke that had caused him to fall from his mount. But rumors spread quickly that the judge's face had borne an expression of absolute terror and that no blood remained in his body when he was found. Called to examine the body, Dr. Harlow recorded privately that he found 2 small puncture wounds on the judge's neck, partially hidden by his collar and easy to overlook if one wasn't searching carefully. The doctor's suspicions deepened, but he kept this discovery to himself, aware of the danger that such knowledge might bring. Attended by all the prominent citizens of the county was the judge's funeral, including the Silverpines, or rather, Elias, Constance, Victoria, and Thomas. Edgar and Eleanor sent their condolences from abroad, unable to return in time for the ceremony. Dr. Harlow noted in his journal that the family showed not the slightest hint of grief or discomfort during the service, despite the judge having been Eleanor's only living relative. Their expressions remained impassive even during the most moving parts of the eulogy, their eyes constantly scanning the gathering as if assessing potential threats or opportunities. Winter came again, and with it a series of mysterious deaths in the outlying farms. 3 young women, all found in their beds, their bodies pale and bloodless, with no signs of struggle or forced entry to their homes. The only common factor was that each had reported seeing a handsome young man with pale blue eyes in the days before their deaths, a man who had appeared at their doors at dusk, asking for directions or assistance. The descriptions matched Thomas Silverpine, the youngest of the family. But when the sheriff reluctantly visited the manor to investigate, Elias provided a cast-iron alibi for his son. Thomas, he claimed, had been sent to Boston on family business and had been absent from Raven's Hollow for over a month. Letters supposedly sent by Thomas from Boston were produced as evidence, and the sheriff, either convinced or intimidated, dropped his inquiry. Yet Dr. Harlow, who had begun keeping track of the family's movements with obsessive detail, had seen Thomas with his own eyes on the very night one of the girls died. The young Silverpine had been walking along the edge of town just after sunset, moving with his characteristic fluid grace in the direction of the victim's farm. When the doctor reported this sighting to the sheriff, the lawman grew visibly uncomfortable and suggested that perhaps Dr. Harlow had been mistaken in the fading light. Thomas Silverpine is in Boston, the sheriff insisted, his eyes not meeting the doctor's. I've seen the letters myself. Perhaps you saw young William Cooper. People have remarked on the resemblance. William Cooper was a local boy of 15 with red hair and freckles who bore no resemblance whatsoever to Thomas Silverpine. Dr. Harlow left the sheriff's office convinced that the lawman had fallen under the influence of the family, whether through bribery, intimidation, or more supernatural means, he could not determine. By spring of 1823, fear had taken root in Raven's Hollow. Families began securing their homes with elaborate precautions each night, windows nailed shut despite the growing warmth, doors barred, mirrors positioned to reflect entryways, and garlic hanging in door frames, a practice that drew mockery from some but was adopted with increasing frequency as the deaths continued. Dr. Harlow, whose investigation had continued in secret, began to share his findings with a small circle of trusted friends, including Pastor Mitchell from the town church and William Crabtree, a scholar who had retired to Ravens Hollow after years teaching history at Harvard College. Pastor Mitchell, a middle-aged man with a perpetual furrow between his brows, was not the same reverend who had admonished his congregation against gossip following Catherine's revelation. That man, Reverend Blackwood, a distant relation of the judge, had succumbed to a mysterious wasting illness 6 months after defending the Silverpines from his pulpit. His replacement, Mitchell, was made of sterner stuff, a former missionary who had spent years in remote regions of Africa and South America, where he claimed to have encountered phenomena that defied conventional theology. An even more unusual figure in the small mountain community presented William Crabtree. In his 70s, with a shock of white hair and piercing black eyes, he had come to Ravens Hollow ostensibly for the mountain air, which he claimed eased his respiratory complaints. But as his friendship with Dr. Harlow deepened, he confessed a different motivation. He had devoted his scholarly career to the study of what he called parallel beings, entities that resembled humans but existed according to different natural laws. His controversial research had forced his retirement from Harvard, but he continued his studies in private, drawn to Ravens Hollow by rumors of the Silverpines that had reached him through academic correspondence. Regularly met the three men under the guise of a scholarly discussion group, their actual purpose hidden from the wider community. Crabtree, with his extensive knowledge of European folklore, provided historical context for the phenomena they were witnessing, while Pastor Mitchell reluctantly contributed insights from religious texts that dealt with unnatural beings and methods for combating them. It was during one such meeting in late April that they were joined by an unexpected fourth member, Catherine Harlow, who had been secretly documenting the movements of the Silverpine family for months, following them at a distance whenever they left their estate. They never traveled together during daylight, she reported to the astonished men, and I have observed that while they can move about in the sun, they seem weakened by prolonged exposure. Elias, in particular, appears to age visibly after an hour in direct sunlight, only to return to his youthful appearance by the following morning. When her father began to reprimand her for placing herself in danger, Catherine interrupted with information that silenced him completely. Eleanor Silverpine is with child. The servants say she is due to deliver in early September. Stunned the group into silence did the implications of this news. A child born of whatever the Silverpines were, would it share their unnatural traits? Would its birth strengthen their hold on the region? Or might it represent some vulnerability in their otherwise impenetrable defense? Pastor Mitchell was the first to speak. We must take action before this abomination enters our world. The birth of such a creature could herald darkness beyond our imagining. Though troubled by the development, Dr. Harlow cautioned restraint. We still lack definitive proof of their true nature, and even if they are what we suspect, we cannot simply storm the manor and destroy them. Elias has powerful connections in the state government, and any direct action would likely result in our own destruction, legally, if not physically. A third perspective was offered by William Crabtree. What we need is to observe the birth itself. If the child lacks a reflection like its parents, we will have irrefutable evidence to present to authorities beyond Blackwood County, perhaps even to federal officials or scientific institutions. Eventually agreed on a plan did the group. They would attempt to place someone inside Silverpine Manor as the pregnancy progressed, ideally a person with medical knowledge who could legitimately attend the birth. The obvious candidate was Dr. Harlow himself, but his known curiosity about the family made him too suspicious a choice. Instead, they decided to approach Martha Winters, a midwife who had trained briefly under Dr. Harlow and who was known for her discretion. Her services would naturally be sought for the delivery, especially since the Silverpines were unlikely to risk bringing in a physician from outside the area who might notice their peculiarities. Initially reluctant to involve herself in what she perceived as superstitious nonsense was Martha, but the promise of a substantial payment, combined with Dr. Harlowe's insistence that she would be performing a service for science, eventually persuaded her. She agreed to report everything she observed during her visits to the manor and particularly during the birth itself. Throughout the summer of 1823, Martha made regular visits to Silverpine Manor, ostensibly to check on Eleanor's condition and prepare for the delivery. After each visit, she met secretly with Dr. Harlowe to share her observations, which he dutifully recorded in a separate journal dedicated entirely to the case. Martha's reports confirmed many of their suspicions while adding new details. Eleanor was indeed carrying a child, but her pregnancy progressed with unusual speed. Despite claiming conception in late December, by July she appeared to be in the final stages of pregnancy, her belly swollen enormously while the rest of her body remained thin to the point of emaciation. The midwife also noted that the entire household operated on a nocturnal schedule, with the family members most active after sunset and retiring just before dawn. Windows remained heavily curtained at all times, and a complex system of pulleys allowed servants to open and close these draperies without exposing the family to direct sunlight. Most disturbing were Martha's observations about Eleanor's diet. The young woman consumed raw meat multiple times daily, the bloodier, the better, and complained constantly of a thirst that water could not quench. On one occasion, Martha witnessed Eleanor drinking what appeared to be blood from a silver goblet, which Elias claimed was a special tonic prescribed for her condition. "It is an old family remedy," he had explained with that same cold smile that never reached his eyes. "Iron-rich and most efficacious for women in her delicate state." Martha also reported significant changes to the manor itself. The cellar had been extensively renovated, with new rooms constructed behind heavy, locked doors. Strange sounds emanated from these chambers at night, chanting in unfamiliar languages, occasional cries that might have been human or animal, and once a sustained howling that made the very foundations of the house seem to vibrate. The grounds, too, had been modified. Stone circles similar to the one that had surrounded the wedding pavilion now dotted the property, each positioned according to some arcane geometry that Martha could not decipher but which Crabtree believed related to astronomical alignments. Workers had been brought in from outside the region to construct these features, then immediately sent away once their task was completed. As August arrived, tension in Raven's Hollow reached a breaking point. 3 more deaths had occurred in the surrounding area, all following the same pattern, victims found bloodless with small wounds on their necks or wrists. The sheriff, under increasing pressure from the townspeople, had attempted another investigation of the Silverpines but returned from the manor confused and disoriented, unable to recall details of his conversation with Elias. On the night of August 21, 1823, Martha Winters was summoned urgently to Silverpine Manor. Eleanor had gone into labor weeks earlier than even Martha's revised calculations had predicted. The midwife sent word to Dr. Harlowe as arranged, then hurried to the manor, arriving just after sunset. She found the household in a state of controlled chaos. Servants rushed to prepare the birthing chamber while Elias paced the hallway outside, his usual composure shattered by genuine concern. Martha was led to Eleanor's room, where she found the young woman writhing in agony on a bed stripped of all but a single black sheet. Victoria attended her sister-in-law, wiping her brow with a damp cloth and murmuring what sounded to Martha like words in a language she had never heard before. With unnatural speed progressed the labor. Within an hour of Martha's arrival, Eleanor was ready to deliver. The midwife positioned herself to receive the child, trying to maintain her professional demeanor despite the strangeness of the situation. What happened next would haunt Martha Winters until her dying day. As Eleanor gave a final, blood-curdling shriek, the child emerged, not headfirst as nature intended, but somehow flowing out like liquid shadow, formless for a terrifying moment before coalescing into the shape of an infant in Martha's waiting hands. The child, a boy, did not cry. He opened eyes that were fully focused and aware, a deep crimson that faded to the family's characteristic pale blue even as Martha watched. When she tried to clean him with a damp cloth, the water seemed to pass through his skin as if it were mist, leaving no moisture behind. Most disturbing of all, when Martha caught a glimpse of them both in the small hand mirror she carried in her apron pocket, a deliberate act planned with Dr. Harlow, she saw only herself alone, seemingly cradling empty air. With desperate intensity, Eleanor reached for her child, and Martha, her hands trembling, relinquished the infant to his mother. The moment the boy was in Eleanor's arms, his body seemed to become more substantial, more real, as if drawing solidity from her embrace. Then entered Elias, his face transformed by an expression Martha could only describe as triumphant. He approached the bed and gazed down at his grandson with such naked hunger in his eyes that Martha instinctively stepped back. "The first Silverpine to be born in the new world," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "The beginning of our true legacy." Dismissed shortly thereafter was the midwife, with a payment far exceeding the usual fee for her services and a warning from Elias that discretion would be most appreciated regarding certain unusual aspects of the birth. The threat beneath his polite words was unmistakable. Not a timid woman was Martha, she had delivered hundreds of children under the most challenging conditions, from blizzards to battlefields during the War of 1812. But something in Elias Silverpine's eyes as he pressed the heavy purse of gold coins into her hand made her blood run cold. It wasn't merely the implied threat that disturbed her, but the absolute certainty that he would know instantly if she spoke of what she had witnessed, as if he could somehow monitor her thoughts from a distance. Despite this fear, Martha went directly to Dr. Harlow's home, where he, Pastor Mitchell, and William Crabtree awaited her report. The three men listened in horror as Martha described what she had witnessed, her hands shaking so violently that Catherine had to help her drink the brandy her father offered. It wasn't natural, Martha concluded, tears streaming down her face. That child, it isn't human. And the way they looked at it, not with the love of parents or grandparents, but with the satisfaction of men who have completed a long-planned venture. Whatever they are, whatever purpose brought them here, that boy is the culmination of it. Crabtree, who had been taking notes throughout Martha's account, looked up with a grave expression. "This aligns precisely with the Carpathian texts I studied at Heidelberg," he said. The birth of a shadow child to parents who themselves lack reflections is described as the completion of a cycle, the point at which their kind becomes truly native to a new land. The old manuscripts claim that such births are exceedingly rare and require specific conditions, a celestial alignment, sacred ground, and the mixing of bloodlines that already carry the trait. His face ashen, Pastor Mitchell added, "In the apocryphal Book of Enoch, there is mention of children born of shadow and night who would eventually inherit the dominions of men. I always interpreted this metaphorically, but now..." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Long into the night debated the group, weighing their options and the potential consequences of various courses of action. By dawn, they had reached a decision. They would gather evidence methodically over the coming weeks, documenting everything they could about the Silverpines and their unnatural child, then take their case to the governor himself, bypassing local authorities who might be under Elias's influence. But events were to overtake their careful planning. 3 days after the birth, Ravens Hollow awoke to discover Silverpine Manor abandoned. The family, their servants, and all portable valuables had vanished in the night, leaving only empty rooms and disturbed earth behind. Sheriff Thomas Morgan, a practical man who had always dismissed rumors about the Silverpines as superstitious nonsense, organized a search of the property. What he and his deputies discovered shook his rational worldview to its core. The manor's cellar, which extended deep into the hillside, contained evidence of activities that defied innocent explanation: stone altars stained with what appeared to be blood, chains affixed to the walls, their manacles sized for both adults and children, a collection of surgical implements arranged with meticulous precision beside a long table fitted with restraints. Most disturbing was a hidden chamber accessed through a revolving bookcase, which contained 7 small coffins. 6 were empty, but the 7th held the remains of what might once have been a child, now nothing more than dust and fragile bones with curious markings carved into the skull. The sheriff's report, preserved in county records, describes his findings in clinical detail, though it notes that 3 of his deputies resigned their positions immediately following the investigation, refusing to discuss what they had seen beneath the manor. Sheriff Morgan himself, previously known for his bluff-heartedness and robust constitution, seemed to age a decade in the days following the search. He began to drink heavily and was found dead by his own hand less than a month later, leaving a cryptic note that read only, "They are still watching. They will return. May God have mercy on us all." An investigation revealed a series of tunnels beneath the manor, extending far into the surrounding forest, passages that appeared to have been constructed years before, perhaps even as the house itself was being built. These tunnels showed signs of recent use, with multiple footprints in the damp soil leading away from the property. The family's sudden departure might have been the end of the story, a relief to the troubled community they left behind. But Dr. Harlow and his circle of confidants knew better. The Silverpines hadn't gone far, just far enough to escape immediate scrutiny. Reports began to reach them of a new family taking residence in Darkwater, a small settlement some 50 miles west, deeper into the mountains. A wealthy merchant named Edward Pine, his wife Constance, their 3 adult children, and an infant grandson had purchased the old Miller estate, paying in gold coin, just as Elias Silverpine had done decades earlier. The descriptions matched perfectly, the father tall and commanding, the mother ethereally beautiful, the children all with a distinctive combination of raven black hair and pale blue eyes. Only their surname had changed, and even that transformation was hardly subtle. It was as if they felt so secure in their power, so certain of human gullibility, that they saw no need for elaborate disguise. Into a frenzy of activity sent the news Dr. Harlow. He dispatched Catherine to Darkwater under the pretext of visiting a school friend, instructing her to observe the new residents from a safe distance and report back. Meanwhile, he, Crabtree, and Pastor Mitchell delved deeper into their research, now with the benefit of Martha's eyewitness account of the birth to guide their inquiry. Visibly shaken by her experience returned Catherine after a week. She confirmed that the Pine family was indeed the Silverpines, though they had altered their appearance slightly. Elias now wore a beard, Constance had lightened her hair to a dark auburn, and the children dressed in simpler styles than they had affected in Raven's Hollow. But their unnatural grace and the peculiar intensity of their gaze remained unmistakable. More troubling was Catherine's report of the atmosphere in Darkwater. "The whole town seems bewitched," she told her father and his colleagues. "They speak of the Pines with a reverence bordering on worship, though the family has been there less than a month. Edward Pine has already been appointed to the town council and offered the position of magistrate, which he graciously declined while suggesting his son Edgar for the role instead." She described how the family had immediately begun to replicate their strategy from Raven's Hollow, large donations to local institutions, strategic investments in businesses, carefully cultivated relationships with influential residents. But this time, their integration into the community was happening much more rapidly, as if they had refined their approach based on past experience. Most disturbing was Catherine's account of a young woman named Mary Sullivan, who had been hired as a nursemaid for the infant. She was changed, Catherine said, struggling to find the right words. "I knew Mary from childhood. Our mothers were friends. She was always full of life, quick to laugh. But now she moves like a sleepwalker, her eyes vacant except when she looks at the child. Then they fill with such devotion it borders on madness. And there are marks on her wrists and neck, small wounds partially hidden by her collar and sleeves. A living vessel they've made her," murmured Crabtree, his academic detachment momentarily giving way to genuine horror. "A source of fresh blood for the infant. The texts mention this. They select a young, healthy woman of good character, form a bond of dependency, and feed from her until she is completely drained, physically and spiritually. Then they find another. In the months following, these events began to fail the doctor's health. His obsession with the Silverpine case consumed him until little else occupied his mind. He suffered a minor stroke in the winter of 1823, leaving his right arm partially paralyzed and his speech occasionally slurred. Catherine took over his practice and cared for him as he weakened, but she too remained vigilant, maintaining correspondence with contacts throughout the region who might provide information about the family's movements. Despite his physical decline, Dr. Harlowe's mind remained sharp. He dictated extensive notes to Catherine, who dutifully transcribed his observations and theories. The doctor had begun to perceive patterns that extended beyond the Silverpines themselves, connections to other families with similar traits scattered across the young nation, suggesting a network rather than an isolated case. He traced shipping records and land purchases, identifying at least 3 other family groups that displayed the same characteristics: exceptional wealth from untraceable sources, unusual physical appearance, aversion to mirrors, and a pattern of migration every few decades. Most significantly, all had arrived in America from Eastern Europe between 1785 and 1795, a period of political upheaval that had driven many legitimate refugees to seek new lives across the Atlantic. They came as a wave, Dr. Harlowe dictated to Catherine one evening, his voice growing stronger as he outlined his theory. Disguised among the true exiles, slipping into our country at a time when record-keeping was chaotic and identities easily fabricated. And now they established themselves in strategic locations, ports, crossroads, territorial capitals, preparing for some larger purpose we can only guess at. Through her correspondence had developed her own insights, Catherine. She noted that each of these families seemed to be pursuing slightly different approaches to assimilation and reproduction. The Silverpines had produced the first known natural birth of their kind on American soil, but others were apparently attempting different methods of propagation, including adoption and what she delicately termed conversion of willing subjects. In the spring of 1824, nearly a year after the birth, they received word that Edward Pine had begun construction on a new home in Darkwater, a mansion even grander than Silverpine Manor. More troubling were reports that 6 young women had disappeared from the area since the family's arrival, their bodies discovered weeks later, drained of blood. Now confined to his bed, Dr. Harlowe dictated a final journal entry to Catherine. "I fear we have failed in our duty to stop this evil from taking root in our land. The Silverpines, or Pines, as they now call themselves, have established their bloodline here, and I believe their purpose is nothing less than the creation of a dynasty that will spread throughout our young nation as it grows. The child born without reflection is but the first of his kind on these shores. There will be others. They are patient, these creatures. They think in terms of centuries, not years. What is a few decades of careful planning to beings who do not age as we do? I leave this record in the hope that others will continue the work we began, tracking this family through its inevitable transformations, documenting their movements and activities, and perhaps eventually finding a way to end their unnatural existence before they can fulfill whatever dark purpose brought them to our shores." 3 days later died Dr. Harlowe, his body wasted but his mind clear until the end. Honoring her father's final wishes, Catherine gathered all his journals and notes on the Silverpine case and made copies, sending them to trusted individuals across the country with instructions to preserve the information for future generations. One of these copies found its way into the hands of Jonathan Pierce, a young journalist with an interest in unusual phenomena, who would spend the next 2 decades tracking the movements of the family across the expanding United States. Pierce had begun his career at the Baltimore Sun, where his talent for investigative reporting quickly became apparent. However, his fascination with stories that strayed beyond the bounds of conventional explanation earned him a reputation as eccentric. After publishing a series of articles on alleged hauntings in Maryland that his editor deemed too credulous by half, Pierce left mainstream journalism to establish the Empirical Observer, a small periodical dedicated to the systematic investigation of unexplained events. It was through this publication that he first encountered Dr. Harlowe's research. A subscriber, knowing Pierce's interests, forwarded him the copy of Harlowe's journals that Catherine had distributed. Pierce immediately recognized the significance of the account, not just as an isolated curiosity, but as potential evidence of a pattern he himself had begun to discern through his own investigations. For Pierce had already documented several cases bearing striking similarities to the Silverpine situation: families with unusual physical characteristics, mysterious sources of wealth, and connections to unexplained disappearances or deaths in their vicinity. What made Harlowe's research so valuable was its methodical documentation and the doctor's evident commitment to scientific observation. Despite the outlandish nature of his findings, Pierce's investigation revealed a pattern. The Silverpines would establish themselves in a community under a slightly altered name, remain for approximately 20 years, just long enough for people to begin noticing their lack of aging, then disappear overnight, only to reappear elsewhere with a new identity. They preferred remote locations initially but gradually moved to more populous areas as the country developed, perhaps finding it easier to hide their nature amid the anonymity of growing cities. By 1844, Pierce had traced them to a substantial estate outside Charlotte, North Carolina, where they lived under the name Silverwood. The family had grown. The original child, now a young man of 21 who went by the name James Silverwood, had two siblings, a sister, Elizabeth, born in 1830, and a brother, Richard, born in 1840. All three children shared the family trait: they cast no reflection in mirrors or water. But as Pierce would discover through careful investigation, their condition manifested in different ways depending on the circumstances of their birth and early feeding. James, the eldest, born of a mother who had consumed human blood throughout her pregnancy, exhibited the most pronounced supernatural traits. He could move with impossible speed, possess strength far beyond that of mortal men, and could exert a mesmerizing influence over others with just his gaze. But sunlight weakened him severely, and he could not cross running water without assistance. Pierce documented an incident in which James, now using the surname Silverwood, was observed by multiple witnesses lifting a fallen oak tree that had blocked a road near the family estate. The tree, estimated to weigh over 2 tons, was raised and moved aside with no apparent effort. When questioned later by struck neighbors, James claimed that several farmhands had assisted him, though no one else had been seen in the vicinity at the time. His speed was similarly remarkable. A hunting party once glimpsed him moving through the forest at dusk, covering nearly half a mile in seconds, leaping over fallen logs and streams with the fluid grace of a deer but the purposeful direction of a man. The hunters, respectable men not given to tall tales, were so disturbed by the sight that they abandoned their expedition and returned to town, refusing to enter those woods again. Most disturbing was James's ability to influence minds. Pierce collected accounts from various sources describing how people who entered into negotiations with James, whether for business contracts, property sales, or even marriage arrangements for local girls, would arrive with firm intentions, only to leave having agreed to terms entirely favorable to the Silverwoods, with no memory of how their resolve had crumbled. A local magistrate who had intended to investigate allegations of impropriety against the family returned from his meeting with James convinced of their absolute innocence, going so far as to publicly denounce the accusers as jealous fabricators. When reminded of his previous suspicions, the magistrate appeared genuinely confused, insisting he had never harbored any doubts about the Silverwoods' character. Elizabeth, whose mother had apparently subsisted primarily on animal blood during pregnancy, showed fewer obvious powers but suffered fewer limitations as well. She could move about in daylight with only minimal discomfort and retained no aversion to running water or traditional repellents such as garlic and religious symbols. Her most notable ability, according to Pierce's sources, was a form of empathic manipulation. She could sense the emotions of those around her and subtly influence their feelings toward herself and her family. This talent made her particularly effective in social situations, where she could detect suspicion or fear and gradually replace these negative emotions with trust and affection. Elizabeth had become a fixture in Charlotte society, hosting musical evenings and literary gatherings that attracted the city's intellectual elite. Her apparent interest in humanitarian causes, orphanages, hospitals, schools for the poor, earned her a reputation for benevolence that helped deflect any questions about her family's more peculiar habits. Yet those who worked closely with her on these charitable projects often reported feeling strangely drained after spending time in her company, describing headaches, weakness, and occasionally memory gaps regarding their interactions. Young Richard, about whom Pierce had the least information, seemed to represent a further evolution. According to servants' gossip that reached the journalist's ears, the boy could actually maintain a reflection for brief periods when necessary, a skill that required intense concentration but allowed him to move through human society with far less risk of detection than his predecessors. Richard attended a prestigious boarding school in Charleston, returning home only for holidays. His teachers described him as brilliant but reserved, excelling in all subjects but forming no close friendships with his peers. Most telling was the report from a school physician who had examined Richard after he collapsed during a midday athletic competition. The doctor noted that the boy's skin had blistered severely in a pattern that corresponded exactly to the areas exposed to direct sunlight. Yet these wounds had healed completely within hours, leaving no scars. Pierce theorized that the family was deliberately breeding for specific traits, seeking to eliminate the weaknesses that had traditionally limited their kind while preserving their unnatural powers and longevity. Each generation represented an experiment, a step toward creating beings who could walk undetected among humans while maintaining their superiority. In his final report, dated October 1844, Pierce wrote, "I believe the Silverpine family, under whatever name they currently use, represents an existential threat to humanity itself. They are not content merely to exist alongside us, they seek to perfect their bloodline until they can replace us as the dominant species on this continent. Their children, born without reflections, growing stronger and less limited with each generation, are the vanguard of this silent invasion. By the time their plan becomes obvious to the world at large, it may already be too late to stop them. Consider the trajectory. Elias and Constance, the original immigrants, required complete seclusion and exhibited significant vulnerabilities to sunlight, running water, and reflective surfaces. Their children, Edgar, Victoria, and Thomas, could move more freely among humans but still needed to exercise extreme caution. The third generation, beginning with James, shows markedly fewer limitations while retaining or even enhancing their unnatural capabilities. If this progression continues, within another 2 generations they may produce individuals who can pass entirely for human while retaining their superhuman strength, longevity, and mental powers. Such beings could infiltrate the highest levels of government, finance, and industry without detection. More concerning still is their apparent coordination with similar families across the nation. My research has uncovered evidence of regular communication between these groups, cryptic messages in newspaper personal columns, periodic gatherings disguised as exclusive social events, and a shared symbolic language found in property markers and architectural details of their residencies. I have identified at least 17 distinct family groups from Maine to the newly incorporated Texas, all exhibiting the same basic characteristics despite operating under different names. If each follows the Silverpine model of controlled breeding to strengthen their bloodline, we may soon face a network of hundreds of these beings strategically positioned throughout our society. I entrust this information to those who come after me, for I fear my own time grows short. I have observed the Silverwood estate for too long, and I believe they have become aware of my presence. Twice now I have seen a figure watching me from the tree line when I believed myself well hidden. And last night I found the door to my lodgings unlocked, though I am certain I secured it before retiring. If I should disappear or meet with some accident in the coming days, let this record stand as my final testimony and warning. The children born without reflections walk among us, growing more numerous and more powerful with each passing year. They are patient, they are cunning, and they are hungry. 3 days after writing these words vanished Jonathan Pierce. His landlady reported that he left his lodgings one evening and never returned, leaving behind all his possessions, including the extensive notes and journals that would eventually form the basis for this account. Local authorities investigated briefly but concluded that Pierce had simply moved on without settling his affairs, a common enough occurrence in those days. The matter was forgotten by all except a small circle of individuals who had corresponded with Pierce and understood the significance of his work. The Silverwood family remained in Charlotte until 1857, when they departed suddenly following a series of unexplained deaths in the city. Their estate was purchased by a distant relative, a convenient fiction that allowed them to maintain ownership while adopting a new identity. The circumstances of their departure were particularly notable.